something beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. This is the first part of a two-part review and discussion of a new book that was recommended to me by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who wrote the foreword. The book is entitled Israel, Winner of the 2003 Iraq Oil War, Undue Influence, Deceptions, and the Neocon Energy Agenda. It was written by a U.S. official who had worked on the Pentagon's pre-war planning as a member of the Energy Infrastructure Planning Group in Washington before becoming the first U.S. civilian to enter Iraq's Ministry of Oil HQ in Baghdad in April of 2003. He worked for the U.S. occupation and continued working in Iraq until 2011. I believe that this is such an important book that it merits reviewing it in detail. Part 2 should arrive in a couple weeks, since Bryce and I will likely first do an episode on the chaotic events that we are currently living through. Devil's Chess Club is part of the American Exception podcast. If you want to see this episode in its entirety, and if you want to have access to, in my biased opinion, the best podcast collection of deep political and historical analysis, please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception. A link is in the show notes. If you can afford it, please subscribe. The more subscribers we have, the more we can do. Among other things, we're trying to make a documentary film based on Peter Dale Scott, his biography, his political, historical scholarship, and his amazing poetry. But we need help to do this. So please subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. As I said in the intro, this is the first part of an unusual pair of episodes in which I'm going to review in some detail and comment upon a book by Gary Vogler called Israel, Winner of the 2003 Iraq Oil War. This was recommended to me by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, and it deals with a lot of aspects of the Iraq War, some of which I was familiar with, but others which came as news to me and were pretty shocking, some details. And I feel like this book is full of such significant information that it really does deserve a detailed review. And again, I'm hoping to get Gary Vogler to come on this show later. Maybe I can reach out to him through Larry. And at the very least, hopefully Larry can come on and talk about this after we're done with this series. I think there will be another episode between this and part 2. We'll probably do something with Bryce and me in which we'll review some current events and all the crazy things that have been going down. But I feel like there's a lot of YouTube channels that are already doing that and giving you the daily update on the insanity in the Middle East and really all over NATO world, U.S. American empire world. So here I thought that this was an opportunity to look at a book, an insider account, to try to further elaborate on the enormous amount of control that Israel has over U.S. foreign policy, especially since the end of the Cold War. So I want to give a little bit of background about Gary Vogler. And before he wrote Israel, Winner of the 2003 Iraq Oil War, which is a pretty short book that I'm going to be reviewing here, he wrote a memoir that came out a few years earlier, maybe around 2018 or so. And I'm going to read you a little bit from the preface so that you get a sense of his background. He wrote, "This book is more than just my memoirs. It covers the Iraq oil story over my 5 months of pre-war planning and 75 months in Iraq. October 2002 until September 2011. As a member of the Energy Infrastructure Planning Group, EIPG, I participated in the interagency oil sector planning at the Pentagon. After EIPG, I moved to retired Lieutenant General Jay Garner's Office for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, so the ORHA, if you love acronyms. I moved to the ORHA team as a senior oil advisor in January 2003. ORHA started planning at the Pentagon and then deployed to Kuwait in March. On March 17, 2003, we began moving into Iraq about a month later. As the first American civilian to enter the Ministry of Oil headquarters in Baghdad on April 25, 2003, my initial task was to appoint the first post-Saddam Iraqi oil sector leadership team on May 3, 2003. The Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA, under Ambassador L. Paul Bremer, governed Iraq until June 2004. My tenure as an oil advisor continued through the CPA era. So there are many revelations and interesting anecdotes in this book, and I'm going to read passages and quotes from the second and more significant book here, I think, and the more punchy book, Iraq winner of the 2003 Iraq oil war. Israel winner of the 2003 Iraq oil war. And I recommend that anybody purchase this book if you have any interest in this subject. It's extremely valuable as a resource for anybody, especially if you want to write anything on it, but really if you just want to have it for your own knowledge about this important and tragic episode. This is a very useful book written from an insider and from someone. He's not someone who has a general political perspective that I would have or other, anti-imperialist leftists would have. And in that way, it makes... So you could gripe about this if you wanted to spend your time doing that, but to my mind, it is perhaps even more valuable for that because it's written as a kind of sober person who's having to be honest with things that probably contradict a lot of his core assumptions that he held before he began, this journey of trying to work for the occupation and then coming to realize what had happened. So the chapter is broken down into the book is broken down into a number of chapters that I'm going to try to go through here. But the first one is the first chapter is feedback on Iraq and the politics of oil. And he says here about this, he kicks this off saying, "It is important that my story be told. It is the history of how the neoconservatives inside the Bush administration worked secretly with the Israel lobby and the Israeli government to fix Israel's energy security crisis. Israel has significantly benefited since the 2003 Iraq War, while our country has incurred significant costs. My role was that of an unwitting contributor to their success. The events, assessments, and conclusions described in this book are from my personal experience." So he has to come to grips with many of his own short-sighted, aspects here, and as disillusionment generally. It's a pretty amazing thing. I guess people have written memoirs about this after the Vietnam War and after the Iraq War. You had a number of different ones, but this one is more revealing in terms of how much he actually says about Israel. So here's a quote from the book. He had spoken to an officer about his experiences there, a person who'd been a veteran for a long time. And this guy said to Gary Vogler, Gary had been naive about Washington's special interest during his 5 months of pre-war oil planning in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and during his 75 months of service in Iraq. And he also said that, hey, don't be offended that I'm calling you naive, because I was pretty naive for my entire 38 years on active duty, along with every other general officer that he knew. He also talks about some disturbing things related to Rumsfeld and in general the U.S. Orientation toward Israel. At one point, he talks about speaking to a high-level official who shares a remarkable anecdote. He says, He lowered his voice to say that he wanted to share something with me, but that he would deny it if I ever quoted him by name. He alleged that Donald Rumsfeld was quoted by one of his close advisors as stating during a moment of frustration that he did not run the Pentagon, but AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, did. That's a remarkable statement. He writes, think about that comment. The Secretary of Defense himself was stating that a powerful foreign lobby was running the Pentagon. It's also notable that as far back as when the Jack and Robert Kennedy were around, a young Congressman, Donald Rumsfeld, wrote a letter to Robert Kennedy, as I recall, inquiring about the efforts to force the Zionist Organization of America to register as a foreign agent. And this was something that the Israel lobby of the day very much resisted, and Rumsfeld was basically carrying water for them. So if he wants to complain about how Israel took over U.S. foreign policy and made it hard for him to run the Pentagon when he was the Secretary of Defense, maybe Rumsfeld should reflect on his own role in that incremental corruption of the U.S. government. The question about the Iraq War, a huge one, which is still, looming over all of us, is why did Bush go to war? For Vogler, he identifies two reasons about why he was so motivated to go to war. The first was essentially Bush's desire to avenge his father for a supposed assassination attempt that Saddam Hussein had planned. But this is dubious. This is, people would dispute whether this was really credible at all. The second one, and I'll read here from Vogler, was to ensure that the Israel lobby did not prevent George W. Bush from winning a second term. Bush was convinced that his father lost to Bill Clinton in 1992 because he had lost the support of the Israel lobby. Bush 41 had received 27% of the Jewish vote in 1988, but only 13% in 1992. Bush 43 was not going to repeat the mistakes of Bush 41. Now, this jives with things that I have been talking about in the past on Devil's Chess Club and American Exception, which is that it seems that even according to Israeli sources, like the Jerusalem Post, as I recall, George H.W. Bush had greatly upset the Israel lobby by essentially forcing Israel to enter into negotiations for a Palestinian state by threatening to withhold loan guarantees if Israel did not do so. So, as I've argued before, George H.W. Bush, a CIA man, establishment man, oil man, very spooky character, and not somebody that I would hold up as a good moral statesman of any kind. I mean, he's a deep statesman, a servant of the American oligarchy and the American empire, but he recognized, and others, people like Brzezinski and so on, people on the the more realist side of the U.S. imperial foreign policy establishment, recognized that full-on support of Israel, as the neocons wanted, was going to be dangerous to U.S. interests because they were obsessed with this idea of greater Israel and basically crushing and balkanizing the rest of the Middle East. And people recognized that this could be dangerous for the U.S. interest, that it could basically unite the region, maybe even unite the world against the U.S. as it was part of a really unjust situation. But the pro-Israel forces and represented by the neocons, they had enormous political power in the United States, and they were able to defeat Bush. He cites the Jewish vote, 27% of the Jewish vote, and only 13% in 1992, but I don't see that as being especially decisive. The Jewish vote in the United States is not a huge portion of the electorate. And yet, as we find out time and again in the U.S., when AIPAC wants a congressman or a senator to lose an election or a primary, they can make that happen. They have enormous resources to rally on behalf to get political outcomes that they want. They seem to have enormous influence in the media. Civil society is afraid to criticize Israel because of donations and so on, so-called philanthropy, the different funders of and wealthy alumni at universities and so on. You see this happen again and again. Like, why did all these university professors crack down on all these protests? It was because of the influence of pro-Israel donors. This is a difficult issue in American politics, and it's difficult to speak about because the Israel lobby has so effectively created a propaganda that states that if you start to criticize the influence of the Israel lobby, that you are somehow, feeding into anti-Semitic tropes, and that it's like a form of racism to question these things. It's anti-Semitism, which is what really means anti-Judaism, but they always say the anti-Semitism thing. It's a strange thing the more you think about it. So this is fascinating to me that he points this out, because he's not looking at it from the perspective I was. He was only saying what the common sense was around the time. And yes, I do believe that. And the other aspect of this that's important, which will come up later, is that it's often credited, his defeat in 1992 is often credited to the entry of Ross Perot into the race. But I find that to be a weird event as well. And it has a funny connection to this story, as we'll get into, which is actually not in the book, but I found myself. Now, as for the reason for the Iraq War, he cites, Vogler does, a source that I wouldn't necessarily consider authoritative unless he is kind of saying something that you don't expect him to say or testifying against interest. And in this case, that's what's happening. I'm talking about Thomas Friedman, the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist, as Vogler describes him. And he's saying that the war wouldn't have happened without the neoconservatives. So I'll read the quote from Friedman. This was in early April 2003, so very close after the war began. Friedman wrote, "It's the war the neoconservatives wanted. It's the war the neoconservatives marketed. Those people had an idea to sell when September 11 came, and they sold it. Oh boy, did they sell it. I could give you the names of 25 people who, if you had exiled them to a deserted island a year and a half ago, the Iraq War would not have happened." Friedman did not name these neoconservatives, Vogler writes, but many were occupying important positions in the Bush administration, including Paul Wolfowitz, Doug Feith, Lewis Libby, Richard Pearl, Elliot Abrams, Michael Ledeen, David Wormser, and David Frum, among others. He also mentions that Pearl and Feith and Wormser had been part of this 1996 report commissioned by Bibi Netanyahu, the Clean Break Report, which called for regime overthrow in Iraq, Syria, and Iran. So this is significant. Also, Vogler cites Philip Zelikow, who revealed at a conference at the University of Virginia in 2002 that Israel's security problems were an important factor for a push for war. The question is, why would all of these neoconservatives be so motivated to this war, even if they were committed to Israel? And he pointed out that there was a severe energy crisis in the late 90s for Israel. And he sees this as being something that the Iraq War helped to solve, at least for a time. So this is, I think this is a very important paragraph here. He says, "This book discusses the neocon oil agenda for getting Iraqi oil into Israel. It discusses the who, what, where, why, and how of that agenda. It covers the initial plan of opening a pipeline between Kirkuk, Iraq, and Haifa, Israel, which would never work, so an alternative plan was executed. The book discusses how the U.S. continues to support operations in Syria that provide more oil to Israel. It covers the history of Lewis Libby's role in Israel's energy security, first as Mark Rich's lawyer and later from his position in the office of the vice president. It also covers how a suspected Mossad asset, Michael Makovsky, was placed into an important position at the Pentagon and given a top secret SCI clearance to help dictate the oil agenda." And he writes about this character, Makovsky. He'll come up again, but he says, "Today, Makovsky is the CEO of the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, formerly Affairs, JINSA, located so they changed it from Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs to the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. They took that name later, which is something to ponder. It's only located a few blocks from the White House. Several years ago, I spoke with an intelligence resource who described that organization as a front for Mossad. The JINSA website The JINSA website states that their mission is to fund trips to Israel by retired U.S. general officers to meet with Mossad. So there you have it. And an interesting thing about this book is that the author says, I've always considered myself pro-Israel and still do today. However, having witnessed and experienced many abuses by the Israel lobby in matters surrounding Israel's energy security, I'm convinced that greater transparency of foreign lobbyists is necessary on the part of the U.S. government. So he's basically calling for strengthening the Foreign Agents Registration Act and basically enforcing it against Israel. And I think that that is a modest proposal and probably would not completely deal with the heart of the problem. And yet, even with that, it's funny because it doesn't seem likely to be in the offing anytime soon, that sort of a change of policy. The second chapter of Vogler's book is The Oil Agenda Original Plan. And he starts off this chapter saying, a plan of simply opening the valves on a pipeline in the Iraqi desert after the pipeline had been closed for more than 50 years may have seemed foolish to most people, but the Israeli government and the neoconservatives in the Bush administration intended to make it happen. In June 2003, Netanyahu had visited London to find investors who would help him to pitch this plan to revive this pipeline that had been planned to transport basically, Arab oil through Israel. And he described this as, it's not a pipe dream. So that's what Netanyahu told these people. The pipeline in question had been used to export Iraqi oil to Haifa, a port in Palestine, on the coast there, the Mediterranean. And this was active from 1934 until the 1948 war. And at that point, the Iraqis didn't want to recognize Israel, and they weren't going to send any more of their oil through Israel. So they came up with an alternative to sending oil to Haifa, and that was to build a pipeline to Banias, Syria in 1952. So the shipments to Haifa stopped. IPC, the Iraqi Petroleum Company, I believe, needed a new export channel for handling its production from northern Iraq. They constructed a new pipeline to Banias, Syria, in 1952 in order to get that oil to the Mediterranean. And it was operational until April 2003. With one exception, it was damaged a little bit during Operation Desert Storm, the original Gulf War under George H.W. Bush. Now, what's significant here regarding this pipeline that was going to go through Syria is that in March 2003, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz ordered General Franks to destroy the K3 pump station. And if you look at this map from the book, you can see here, where if this arrow shows up, the K3 pump station, which is here sort of at the junction between the oil coming out of central Iraq, and then it could go either to Syria, that Syria pipeline, or that Haifa pipeline. So this is significant. Wolfowitz's order to destroy the K3 pump station conflicted with the then recently declassified written order by President Bush's cabinet that no oil infrastructure should be intentionally attacked during the invasion. The Syria pipeline was specifically identified not to be attacked. I think this is significant because it shows that even within the W. Bush administration, which was already marching to, the neocon drummer pretty much by staging the invasion in the first place, there were some disagreements about how to handle this oil issue, which I was aware of to some degree. Like, I'd understood that the neocons had a different strategy compared to the, old Bush, James Baker crowd of oil men, politicians and such. So I think this is significant. A key figure here was Ahmed Chalabi. And so the Volker writes, reopening the old pipeline from Kirkuk to Haifa was the original plan sold to the neoconservatives and the Israeli government in the late 1990s by Ahmed Chalabi, the leader of the Iraqi National Congress. So Chalabi was a guy who sold himself to the Neocons, and the Neocons basically sold him to the U.S. leadership. He was essentially a Neocon asset, which means functionally an Israeli asset. He delivered all of these speeches to Israel lobby organizations in D.C. in the run-up to the Iraq War, most notably to GINSA, who we just talked about earlier, in June 1997, at a time when Israel was still paying big premiums on oil imports. Iran had been a part of the Israeli energy situation. They'd used this secret pipeline to sell Iranian oil to Mediterranean customers, and Israel kept 250,000 barrels a day. This arrangement ended in 1995. So a lot of the time that Iran had sanctions placed on it, not because of the U.S., after taking those hostages, etc., they still were able to sell oil to the West, but it had to be basically, laundered through Israel, which became like the broker of Iranian oil. You can see this other pipeline that they're talking about, the Eilat Eshkelon pipeline, and it goes from the Red Sea, the Gulf here of the Red Sea that's on the other side of Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, and it goes all the way up to Israel. And this pipeline was used, the Iranians would ship oil in tankers all the way there, and then it would go through Israel and over here to Ashkelon. And then Israel would keep a good bit of that, 250,000 barrels a day, and this helped Israel's energy situation a lot. After it ended, they had to essentially pay a 25% premium on oil, and this was very bad for Israel and the Israeli economy. So, Vogler had initially written that the oil wasn't so much a part of the agenda behind the Iraq War. Initially, he believed that. He revises that when he writes the memoir, the earlier and larger book about this, and he explains why he came to believe that this had changed, why his own perspective changed. He says, he wants to share a few facts he learned during his research for the 2017 book. When I compare these newfound facts to my personal experiences at the Pentagon and in Iraq, I could no longer deny an oil agenda. It was not an easy change for me. The more I learned about the agenda, the angrier I became. I could not sleep at night. My blood pressure boiled. My wife rushed me to the hospital one Sunday afternoon in 2015. We thought I was having a stroke. So he goes on to write about some of the things that he learned about the situation, which changed his point of view. He did a lot of reading of earlier and contemporary articles, including one by Haaretz, an interview with the Israeli Infrastructure Minister Joseph Paritsky from March 31st, 2003. The troops were still fighting, of course, at this time, and Paritsky was publicly bragging about the huge windfall that Israel would experience from the war. He identified the agenda, the players involved, the timing, and most importantly, the hidden motive, getting Iraqi oil to Israel by the end of 2003 to relieve the severe 25% premium. The U.S. invasion and a reopened Kirkuk-Haifa pipeline would remedy this problem. Paritsky said that senior civilians at the Pentagon were communicating with him on this objective. So this is written by in the Israeli press. This isn't, some like Free Republic conspiracy theory with no basis in fact. This is coming from the horse's mouth. He wasn't the only member of Israel's cabinet talking about these things in 2003. I'll quote Vogler again. Finance Minister Netanyahu was in London in June promoting the Haifa pipeline to potential investors. It won't be long when you will see Iraqi oil flowing to Haifa. It is not a pipe dream. I mentioned this earlier. Another article quotes, this one's the article that is cited here by Vogler. The article is called How Ahmed Chalabi Conned the Neocons by John Dizzard, and it quotes Mark Zell, Doug Feith's former law partner, who was still trying to develop his Israel law practice based on Chalabi's promises of ending Iraq's boycott of trade with Israel and of a rebuilt pipeline. Quoting Zell, Chalabi said he would end Iraq's boycott of trade with Israel and would allow Israeli companies to do business there. He said the new Iraqi government would agree to rebuild the pipeline from Mosul in the northern Iraq oil fields to Haifa. But Chalabi, whom Zell calls a treacherous, spineless turncoat, delivered on none of these promises. So this is Doug Feith's partner, Doug Feith in the Pentagon, the guy that ran the Office of Special Plans and produced a lot of the Iraq War propaganda. This is what his partner is saying, that a big objective here was to basically make Iraq a big trading partner with Israel, and Israel would be able to do business there, and it would essentially become a U.S./Israel neo-colony. That I think that was a part of the plan. Now, the character that is most interesting, I think, in this book that Vogler discusses is Michael Makovsky. And this fellow is unqualified for a high position on this pre-war planning team. And so Vogler had questions about his experience in the oil business. How did this guy get here? And he actually asks him at one point, and Makovsky says that he's Douglas Feith's brother-in-law. And, Vogler thinks, well, this seems like nepotism. This could be a problem. And so he starts asking some questions to other people about it. He tells an officer about this, and the officer laughs and says that Makovsky just didn't want to share his credentials. So this is significant, I think. During our pre-war planning, I'm reading from Vogler now, Makovsky organized several meetings with private sector companies. All these private sector folks seemed to know Richard Pearl and asked Makovsky about him. Richard Pearl's come up a number of times recently in different episodes that we've discussed on this show and on American Exception and Devil's Chess Club. After one of the meetings, I asked who this Richard Pearl person was. Makovsky only said that he was their godfather. Pearl was also known to others as the Prince of Darkness. He'd been appointed as the Pentagon's chairman of the Defense Policy Board in 2001 and helped to place many Zionist ideologues throughout the Pentagon, such as Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz. Wolfowitz, one of the primary architects of the 2003 Iraq War, had earned the title Wolfowitz of Arabia. Another Pearl appointee, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Douglas Feith, whom CENTCOM Commander General Tommy Franks described as the dumbest effing guy on the planet, had worked for Pearl during the Reagan administration. In 1996, he co-authored the strategy paper, A Clean Break for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the one that basically calls for regime change in Iraq and in numerous other countries in the Middle East, basically balkanizing and kneecapping every other country in the region to allow for Israel to be the agent of U.S. hegemony in the Middle East. So this is pretty serious stuff. You can watch the rest of this episode by subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. There you will find the best coverage and analysis of the deep politics of the U.S. empire. The URL is patreon.com/American Exception, and it's in the show notes. If you can afford it, please subscribe. Part 2 of this review should be out in a couple weeks. I'm also hoping to get the author Gary Vogler and Larry Wilkerson to come on to the show to discuss the book at some point. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for producing this episode, and thank you for tuning in. If nothing else, Vogler's book will be an important collection of evidence for those conducting the historical post-mortem of the neocons' doomed plans for a Zionist-centric new American century. It seems that there is little chance for the U.S. empire, aka the West, to save itself from the disastrous endgame we are witnessing on the devil's chessboard.